It's been another eventful week in federal politics, that's an understatement, with arguments continuing about the impact of the carbon tax, even though it won't be released until Sunday.
Now, the ban on live cattle exports to Indonesia has been lifted, and the behaviour of MPs in Parliament continues to be called into question, with another cat call, this time coming from the government's chief whip, and we heard from Julia Gillard on that yesterday afternoon. For more, we're joined from Sydney by former Democrats leader and former Labor MP Cheryl Kernot. Good morning to you, Cheryl Kernot, and former federal Liberal member for McEwen Fran Bailey is with us here in the studio. Fran Bailey, good morning.
Morning.
There are party liners this morning, and we're going to kick around the main topics and the main issues emerging from federal politics this week. Can I start? And I'll start with you, Cheryl Kernot, on the issue of the cat call and the call out really that Julia Gillard made at the end of the parliamentary session about behaviour being directed towards women in Parliament that men certainly don't have to cop, even though it can get pretty willing. Your reflection on that?
I think the language around a female leader has been pretty awful since she's been the Prime Minister. There's a lot of calling across the chamber. I've been on the receiving end of some of it, but I don't think it's been as gender kind of specific as it has in recent times. And I think that's alarming, and I think Julia made the right call at the end. It doesn't matter what side it comes from, it's inappropriate.
Fran Bailey, I mean, the cat call, the sort of the meow sound has never made it a bloke.
Oh, I think that's absolutely deplorable, and I think that Julia Gillard's statement at the end of question time yesterday was entirely appropriate, and I think Tony Abbott's acknowledgement and thanking her for the swift way that she moved on that as soon as she found out who was the guilty culprit was absolutely right. I think I would disagree with Cheryl in a little way. I think that the names that are hurled across the table to the leaders, that happens whether it's male or female. Whether that's a good thing or not, I think actually John Howard, I always remember, no matter how much he seemed to be provoked, he rarely responded in kind, whereas I think today we've got two pretty fierce combatants across the chamber in Tony Abbott and Julia Gillard, and they both give as much as they get.
Fran, it seems to me that it's not the issue that it doesn't happen to a man, the cat calls, but I've never heard a cat call anywhere else other than in Parliament.
That's a very good point.
So I think it goes to the credibility of the Parliament. It's a small moment, but from people watching it,
that's very true. Imagine if that happened in your professional workplace. Here at the ABC, if a woman or a man was trying to make a point, and someone leaned across and went, "Wow."
Absolutely. Imagine it around the boardroom of a business.
Cheryl Kernot, do you want to jump in there?
Don't forget, though, that it was Julie Bishop who did the original, the action of the cat claw, and I'm sure she regrets that. But I thought the way Penny Wong handled it was superb. I thought she made the case. It shouldn't happen. I think the fact that men default to it is an interesting comment on what might be going on in their head and deeper culturally in Australia, and I think it has to be named and shamed, and that's the way to deal with it.
I think, though, we need to remember that there have been two people have been the guilty parties. The vast majority of MPs do not engage in that sort of behaviour, and so I think we do need to remember that.
No, that's good to bear in mind. They indulge in other behaviour during question time instead, not asking a proper question and not answering a proper question.
Well, that's all part and parcel of the political debate, though. That's actually trying to get your point across.
Cheryl Kernot, sorry, what was that?
It's the silly rules that don't allow you to pursue a point. In the UK, the Leader of the Opposition asks the Prime Minister a question, listens to the answer, gets up and does a supplementary. Yep. The Prime Minister responds, the opposition, they have this toing and froing on content. It would be so nice to see that in our Parliament.
Well, I think that's a very good point, and I think it's one that Harry Jenkins, the Speaker, constantly makes, that, you have to have a change to the standing orders in the Australian Parliament to get the same sort of system that Cheryl is referring to in the British Parliament. And I think everyone, I think MPs, especially the backbenchers who don't get all that many opportunities to ask a question, when they they do get that opportunity, and it's their question, not a question that's been given to them by a minister, they really want an answer to that. They don't want the Prime Minister or one of her ministers, going on for 4 minutes with complete waffle.
Yeah, well, no, I think the frustrates everyone.
I think the independents should go back for another crack at parliamentary reform. I think they might get it. No Dorothy Dixes. That would be a good start.
Okay, well, let's start. Can we move on now to the carbon tax? And I'll start with you, Fran Bailey. Sunday is the critical day where we find out the detail. Do you think that this Labor government has learned enough lessons in the past couple of years to be able to sell that to the Australian people?
Well, I don't think that they have. I think actually the biggest problem that the government has is that I think the vast majority of the community have stopped listening to Julia Gillard.
Yeah.
And they've stopped listening because they don't believe her. But I want to raise an issue with you this morning about, in the detail that's going to be released. Everyone is making a big thing that the government is exempting more companies than anyone thought, and certainly exempting petrol. But at the same time, this government has got a review of the fuel excise happening. Now, it's going to be very easy for the government to introduce or to revert to the policy of the automatic indexation of the fuel excise, which has been frozen since 2001. I think that this is a question that we need to be asking the government. It's all very well you giving out certain information about the exemption of fuel in the carbon package, but what are you going to be doing about fuel excise?
Cheryl Kernot, do you reckon that the government's going to be able to carry this one?
Not sure about that. I think this has been such an almost unsalvageable exercise since Julia Gillard changed her mind on it. I think it's the overall purpose of it's been lost in the detail about who's going to get what. And I think the fact that we're going to move to an ETS, which should be welcomed by most consumers in terms of the impact on them, I think that's been lost. I think this dribbling out of what's in it is counterproductive in the long run, because it focuses on what the government thinks is the good news and hopes we won't pay attention to the other details. And I think they'll be held account to their claim that it'll be revenue neutral, and if the changes in the way they're applying petrol exemptions, fuel exemptions, means that they're $4 billion in the red in the short term, I think people will zero in on that. I think economists and political commentators will zero in on that, and I think the wider public is looking for how much damage. So regrettably, I think we've lost sight of where this might lead us as a nation.
Cheryl Kernot, just a quick question to both you and Fran Bailey. Julia Gillard says, look, this is going to be like the GST, where everyone thought the sky would fall in, but it came in after initial difficulties, it settled down and life moved on. Is this one of those policies where that could happen?
Could be. I thought the GST reaction would last longer, and I still think about it when I look at my bills, but the fact of the matter is that's the political cycle. Once you have all this, it's a pity that it had to be handled this way, because I think all this build-up to it before you had the details has been very damaging. I think people are going to pay attention. Fuel and electricity hit people regularly. I don't know whether they can move on quickly or not. It's not settled for, till they move to the ETS. We'll see.
Okay. Fran Bailey?
I think it's much more difficult than the GST, and I was very heavily involved in the first version of the GST where we could not sell that.
Yes.
The second version was easier because we were certainly doing it from government. But this has
you also had that negotiating position with the Democrats.
Right. But this is far more difficult because you've got so many unanswered questions, and it seems to be changing so rapidly. With the GST, you had a very firm set of principles that, albeit was difficult to explain to people, but with the carbon tax, you've just got, the goalposts seem to be being moved every couple of weeks. So I think it's going to be very, very difficult.
But you didn't have the independents looking for, as if we read if it's true what we read about what Andrew Wilkie's driven the bargain over is, two specific solutions just for his electorate. So I think that will complicate. Not with 4 or 5 of them at the same time.
I think Brian Harradine did pretty well.
It complicates. But we knew what his agenda was, and it was the same thing all the time. But I think it complicates the overall design purity, and I think that's going to make it really hard for the cell.
But essentially, I think we come back to this main point: are the Australian people going to believe what Julia Gillard says? And if you read all the comments that are posted online to articles in newspapers, which I read my newspapers online these days, it's amazing that it is very, very hard to find one positive comment for the government. It's quite incredible. I've never seen so much negative comment against a government.
Well, speaking of negative comment, let's talk about our next issue now and the cattle exports. The decision, some comments from you, Fran Bailey, first on not only the issue itself, but how the government has handled it this week and allowing exports now again.
Well, I think anyone who watched that Four Corners program, and I was one of them, was absolutely appalled. But the way the government has handled it, again, it's bungled it at every single turn. I mean, it's now, got a near neighbour offside, a developing trading partner, a major industry. It really didn't do anything right about this issue. Now it's reinstated the trade, which I think should be reinstated, but it still hasn't dealt with the issue of stunning animals. I mean, the other sectors of primary industry that are exporting live animals, whether it's sheep or whether it's dairy heifers, countries that are receiving these animals from Australia are now starting to take a step back and think, well, is this going to be the next industry that's going to be affected by this very, very, very ordinary decision-making process of the government? So I think it's been very, very badly handled.
Cheryl Kernot, Kevin Rudd's now in Indonesia. We all assume trying to smooth ruffled feathers there. Is he up to the task?
Oh, he's a smoozer. He's no doubt about that. I wondered whether they rushed the announcement out to make sure he couldn't claim the credit. That's a very cynical response.
Oh, you mean for the Sunday announce of the carbon tax?
I happen to agree with Cheryl on that.
You do?
I do, yes.
I thought the fact that Joe Ludwig announced it, so late in the afternoon,
without consulting his own backbench committee.
Yes, given the dissatisfaction in caucus, I thought that was a very curious thing to do. On the other hand, I think they had a huge political problem with being in limbo. I'm disappointed in the compromise because despite all the words around high standards and humane treatment, if you can't guarantee stunning, then I think that's what Australians want most of all. I think there's a percentage of people who want an end to all live trade. I think there's a percentage who want a transition to give the industry time to adapt. And then I think there are those who don't care what happens. But as I see it, maybe the tracing system will tell you where the animals end up, but isn't it after the event, you find out that they haven't gone to a particular abattoir after the event? So I'm a bit worried about that. On the backbenchers speaking up, I mean, Julia Gillard could do what John Howard always did and talk about the broad church, and it actually gives Labor some ownership of that spectrum of the debate, which otherwise would be completely owned by the Greens.
Well, what intrigued me, and you'd have a good reflection on this, I'm sure, Fran Bailey, because of the nature of John Howard,